Tonight, I want to tell you something that no one may have told you in a very long time. And it is simply this: nothing is wrong with you. Not in the way you might hope it to be true, not as a wish or a kind word meant to make you feel better for a moment, but as something the Buddha recognized about every single person who ever lived. Something quiet, something steady, something that has been waiting inside you all along. Tonight, we will sit with that idea, gently, slowly, in the kind of quiet that asks nothing of you. What we will share tonight draws from a tradition that is over 2,500 years old, the wisdom of the Buddha and the teachers who followed in his footsteps. These are teachings that have helped people rest a little easier, forgive a little sooner, and see themselves a little more clearly, not through effort, but through softening. You do not need to know anything about Buddhism to receive what is offered here. You do not need to believe anything. You do not need to remember a single word. These stories do not belong to any religion or any country. They belong to anyone who has ever lain awake, wondering whether they are enough. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from, whether it is late at night or the quiet hours before dawn, whether you are tucked in bed or resting somewhere else entirely. You are welcome here, just as you are, exactly as you are, with everything you are carrying and everything you wish you could put down. These are not lessons to memorize or rules to follow. They are simply stories, invitations to rest. There is nothing you need to understand, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to apply to your life tomorrow morning. If you fall asleep in the middle of a sentence, that is not failure. That is the whole point. The stories will still be here if you ever want to return. And if you do not return, that is fine too. Tonight is enough. If this path of quiet stories calls to something in you, you are welcome to subscribe and return to this space whenever you need a slower night. Tonight we will explore, through stories, what it means to stop believing the voice that tells you something is missing. We will meet people who carried that belief for years, people who looked perfectly fine on the outside, but who lay awake at night, just as you might be lying awake now, turning over the same question: what is wrong with me? We will meet a potter who could not stop breaking her own work because no bowl was ever good enough. We will sit with a retired doctor who spent a lifetime fixing others, but never learned to accept his own weariness. And somewhere along the way, we will hear what the Buddha said about the wholeness that lives beneath every judgment, every doubt, every sleepless night spent wishing you were someone else. These are not extraordinary people. They are ordinary people, the kind of people you pass on the street, the kind of people you already are. And perhaps, by the time their stories are finished, you will feel, not think but feel, that nothing needed to be fixed after all. So settle in now. Let your body grow heavy. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. Let your shoulders drop just a fraction, not because you are trying to relax, but because there is nothing left to hold up tonight. Take one slow, deep breath. Not to change anything, but simply to notice that you are here, that you are breathing, that this moment right now is yours. And let us begin our journey together. Thank you for joining us here at Moonlit Dharma. In a village where the river bent twice before reaching the sea, there lived a woman who made pottery. Her workshop sat at the edge of the water, built on stilts so old that no one remembered who had driven them into the mud. On quiet mornings, mornings like the one we will enter now, she could hear the current moving beneath the wooden floor, a low and steady murmur that sounded almost like someone speaking very softly in another room. The boards were warped from years of dampness, and they creaked when she crossed from the door to the wheel. a sound so familiar it had become part of her breathing. She no longer noticed it. It was simply the sound of her life beginning each day. The air in the workshop always smelled of wet clay and wood smoke from the small iron stove she lit before dawn. In the grey light of early morning, before the sun had cleared the hills across the river, everything in the room looked soft and unfinished. The buckets of slip with their milky surfaces, the drying shelves lined with pots in various stages of completion, the single window fogged with condensation so that the world outside appeared as a smudge of green and silver. There was a cup of tea on the windowsill that she had poured an hour ago and forgotten. The surface had gone cold and still. Her hands were rough from years of shaping. Not rough in a way that hurt, but rough in the way that comes from doing one thing long enough that your body remembers it, even when your mind has wandered elsewhere. The skin on her palms was thick. Her fingernails were always rimmed with clay. No matter how carefully she washed, she would arrive before dawn most days, when the light was still uncertain, and the wheel was cold to the touch. Cold enough that the first time she pressed her foot to the pedal each morning, she could feel the chill travel up through her ankle and settle somewhere behind her knee. She liked this hour. She liked the silence of it, the way the clay felt before it had been asked to become anything. In those first minutes, before the shaping began, the clay was just clay, heavy, wet, without opinion. It did not tell her what it wanted to be. It did not tell her she was doing it wrong. It simply waited. But there was something about her work that never settled. She would finish a bowl, a good bowl, a bowl with even walls and a steady base and a glaze that caught the light, and she would hold it up to the window and turn it slowly in both hands. And somewhere in that turning she would find the flaw, a slight unevenness in the rim that only she could feel, a thumb mark she had not smoothed away, a curve that leaned a fraction to the left, so small that you would need to set the bowl on a perfectly flat surface and stare at it for a long time to notice. And she would set it aside on the shelf by the door, the shelf where the rejected bowls lived, or worse, she would press it back into a lump and start again, as if the bowl had never existed at all. The shelf beside the door was full. Some of the bowls were beautiful. Anyone walking into the workshop would have said so. But she did not see that. She saw only what was missing. One morning, her neighbor came by. The neighbor was an older woman who lived alone at the end of the road, in a house with a garden that grew in every direction, without any apparent plan. She had a habit of walking slowly, as if the ground itself were interesting, and arriving without announcement. She appeared in the doorway of the workshop, the way morning light appears. Gradually, without effort, she looked at the shelf of discarded bowls for a long time. "These are lovely," she said, picking one up and turning it in her hands, the way you might turn a small animal you were trying not to startle. "Those are the ones I am getting rid of," the potter said, without looking up from the wheel. "Getting rid of? Why? Because they are not right." The neighbor held the bowl up to the window, where the light was strongest. She ran her thumb along the rim, feeling the slight unevenness the potter had noticed, the tiny ridge no wider than a grain of rice that had condemned this bowl to the shelf. "Not right for whom?" she asked. The potter stopped the wheel. The clay beneath her hands went still. She looked at the neighbor, then at the bowl, then back at the neighbor. "What do you mean?" "I mean, who told you this was wrong? I have been holding this bowl for a minute now, and it fits my hands perfectly. The clay did not tell you it was wrong. I did not tell you. The river below us did not tell you. So, who told you?" The potter opened her mouth to answer and found she did not have one. The voice that said "not good enough" was so familiar, she had never thought to ask where it came from. It had always been there, in the workshop, in the mirror, in every room she had ever entered, in every conversation she had ever replayed at night. She had assumed it was the truth, the way you assume the sound of the river is just the river. She had never considered that it might simply be a sound her mind had learned to make, like the floorboards had learned to creak, not because anything was wrong, but because that is what they did. I think, the potter said slowly, that the voice has always been there. The neighbor nodded. Most voices like that have been there a long time, she said. But being old does not make them true. It only makes them familiar. She set the bowl down gently on the work table, beside the cold cup of tea. To be beautiful, she said quietly, means to be yourself, not the version of yourself that someone else imagined. Not the version without the thumb marks. Just yourself. Just this. She left without saying anything more. The potter sat alone in the workshop. The wheel was still. The clay was drying on her fingers in thin, pale lines. She reached over and picked up the bowl the neighbor had held. The one with the uneven rim. The one with the ridge no wider than a grain of rice. The one she had been about to destroy, and she held it in both hands. She did not change it. She did not smooth the rim or press the curve. She did not hold it up to the light to search for more flaws. She just held it. And for a moment, in the grey morning light that was finally reaching the wheel, the bowl looked exactly as it was, imperfect, unfinished, and entirely whole. Outside, the river continued beneath the floor, murmuring in its steady voice, carrying nothing, missing nothing, moving exactly as it always had. Tonight, if you are lying here with a list of everything you think is wrong with you, a list you have been adding to for years, so quietly that no one around you even knows it exists, you are not alone in this. Most of us carry a version of that list. We add to it in the dark, when we cannot sleep, when we replay the things we said and the things we failed to say, when we measure ourselves against someone who seems to have it all figured out. The list grows longest at night when no one is watching, when there is nothing to distract us from the voice that says, you should be further along by now. You should be better than this. You should be someone else entirely. But here is what the potter began to understand, and what you may already sense somewhere beneath the noise. The flaw you see in yourself is often invisible to everyone around you. The judgment does not come from the bowl. It comes from inside, and the fact that it has been there for a long time does not make it true. It only makes it familiar. Zen Master Dogen once wrote that when both body and mind are at peace, all things appear as they are, perfect, complete, lacking nothing. He was not describing a state reserved for monks on mountaintops or saints in quiet rooms. He was describing what is already here, right now, in you, the moment you stop insisting that something is missing. And there is another way to see this. Through a life that looked very different from the potter's, but arrived slowly and without announcement at the same quiet truth. In a small house at the edge of a town that had grown up around him, while he was not paying attention, there lived a man who had spent 40 years as a doctor. He had been a good doctor, patient, careful, thorough, in a way that sometimes exhausted his colleagues, but always reassured his patients. He had spent his career listening to other people's bodies, diagnosing what was wrong, prescribing what might help. He knew the sound of a troubled lung, the feel of a swollen joint beneath his careful fingers, the look in a patient's eyes when they were not telling him the whole story. He had been trained to find what was broken and fix it. That was his gift and his burden, and for 40 years it was his entire life. And then he retired and found himself alone in a house with a garden he had never tended, a kitchen he had never really cooked in, and a silence he did not know how to fill. The garden had been his wife's. She had died 3 years before he retired, and he had kept the garden alive out of duty more than love, watering when he remembered, pulling weeds when they became impossible to ignore. The roses had thinned, the herb bed had gone wild, but the bones of the garden were still there. The paths she had laid, the bench she had chosen, the old plum tree in the corner that had been growing at an angle, for as long as either of them could remember. Now, with nothing else to occupy his hands, he began to spend his mornings in the garden. He knelt in the soil and felt the cool earth press between his fingers, a different kind of touch than the one he was used to, slower, less purposeful. He smelled the compost heap at the back fence, sweet and dark and faintly rotting, a smell that reminded him, strangely, of the hospital, of things breaking down so that other things could grow. The autumn light came through the hedge in long amber lines, and the sparrows settled in the branches above him with a sound like small conversations ending. He could not help himself. He tried to fix the garden the way he had fixed his patients. He straightened the stakes. He trimmed the hedges into sharp clinical lines. He pulled every weed he could find, even the ones that were flowering. Especially the ones that were flowering, because they were in the wrong place. And wrong place things had always bothered him. He organized the tools. He labeled the seed packets. He made a plan. And then he came to the old plum tree. It had always leaned, its trunk curved to the left, as if it were reaching for something on the other side of the fence. And its branches grew unevenly, thick on one side, sparse on the other, with one bare patch where the afternoon sun never quite reached. He had been meaning to do something about it for years. Straighten it with cables, prop it up with a brace, or cut it down entirely and replace it with something that grew the way trees were supposed to grow. Upright, symmetrical, correct. He stood before it now with his hands on his hips, the way he used to stand before a difficult diagnosis. And for a moment the old habit took over. Find the problem, fix the problem, move on. But something stopped him. He noticed, truly noticed, perhaps for the first time, that the tree was full of fruit, small, dark plums, the color of bruises, clustered along the crooked branches, hanging heavy and almost ready to fall. The bend in the trunk had not stopped the tree from growing. The unevenness had not stopped it from bearing fruit. The bare patch had not made it less alive. It had simply grown the way it grew, not the way he thought it should, but the way it did. And it was here, and it was bearing fruit. And no one had needed to fix it. Shunryu Suzuki, who founded one of the first Zen centers in America, once offered this gentle observation, that our problems are not actual problems. They are something created, something pointed out by our own self-centered ideas or views. The doctor had spent 40 years diagnosing what was wrong, with lungs, with joints, with blood pressure, with hearts. He had never once turned that question on himself and considered, even for a moment, that the answer might be nothing, that the tiredness he felt was not a symptom, but a fact, that the loneliness was not a disease, but a season, that the feeling of being used up and left behind was not evidence of failure, but simply what it feels like to have lived a full life and arrived, finally, at the part where you are allowed to sit down. He did not cut down the tree. He sat on the bench beside it instead, the bench his wife had chosen. The wood warm from the afternoon sun. The garden was messy. The hedge was uneven. The compost smelled, and the light was beautiful, and the plums were sweet when he finally reached up and picked one, and the sparrows were settling in for the night, making their small sounds, and he was here, just here, and nothing needed to be fixed. The last light of the afternoon caught the bent tree, still standing, still leaning, still full of fruit, It had grown without anyone's permission. And if you had asked him in that moment whether anything was wrong, he would not have understood the question. There is an ancient teaching, one of the oldest in the Buddhist tradition, that says all of this in a single image. It comes from a text called the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, and the image is this. Imagine a piece of pure gold, wrapped in a dirty cloth, lying by the side of a road. Travelers pass it every day. They see the cloth, stained, torn, worthless, and no one stops, no one thinks to look inside. Years pass, decades. The cloth grows dirtier, rain falls on it, dust covers it, and the gold inside does not change. It does not tarnish. It does not lose its weight, or its warmth, or its value. It simply waits, patient and whole, hidden beneath something that was never part of it. The Buddha used this image to describe something he called our Buddha nature, Tathagatagarbha. The word itself means something like the womb, or the essence of awakening. And what he was pointing to is not something you earn through years of meditation or good behavior. It is not something you build by becoming a better person. It is something you uncover by removing, layer by layer, the wrappings that were never yours. The dirt is not you. The cloth is not you. The judgments, the doubts, the sleepless inventory of your own shortcomings. These are the wrappings, they were never the gold. And the gold, quiet, steady, undamaged, has been there all along. Perhaps right now, lying here in this quiet, you can feel something in you that has always been whole. Not a thought. Thoughts are busy things, always measuring, always comparing, always adding to the list. But something beneath the thoughts. Something that has been breathing for you all night without being asked. Something that kept your heart beating through every difficult day you have ever had. Through every sleepless night you have spent wondering what was wrong with you. Your body knows something your mind has not yet accepted. That you are here and you are breathing, and nothing, not the mistakes, not the doubts, not the years of quiet self-criticism, has damaged what you are. Perhaps your shoulders have already dropped a little since we began. Perhaps your jaw has softened without you deciding to soften it. Perhaps the weight of your body has settled more deeply into whatever is holding you. The bed, the pillow, the blanket that has been keeping you warm without asking for anything in return. This is not something you are doing. This is something your body remembers when the mind stops telling it what to feel. You do not need to believe any of this yet. You do not need to do anything with it. Just let it sit beside you. The way the potter let the bowl sit on the table. The way the doctor let the tree stand in the garden. Not fixing, not improving, just noticing what was already there. And perhaps that is enough for now. Let us rest here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is holding you. Notice what has begun to soften since we started this journey together. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is another voice we carry with us, one that may be older than we think. It speaks in the quiet hours, when no one else is listening. And it has something very interesting to say about who told you, in the first place, that something needed to be fixed. There is another voice we carry with us, one that may be older than we think. It speaks most clearly in the quiet hours, when no one else is listening, and there is nothing to drown it out. It is the voice that reviews the day after the day is done, the voice that replays conversations and rewrites them. The voice that looks at everything you did and whispers, "Not enough." Tonight, let us sit with that voice for a while, not to argue with it, not to silence it, just to ask a very simple question. Whose voice is it really? Take a breath, let it go slowly, and let us begin with a man who asked himself that question on a winter evening, in an empty classroom, long after everyone else had gone home. The school was old. One of those buildings that had been built in a time when people believed that learning happened best in tall rooms with high windows. The windows in this particular classroom reached almost to the ceiling, and in winter, when the sun set early, the last of the light would come through them at a low angle and turn the chalk dust in the air into something that looked almost like snow falling sideways. The desks were wooden, scratched with decades of initials and doodles, and they sat in rows that no one had rearranged since September. There were 26 of them. He knew this because he had counted them more than once, on evenings like this one, when he could not bring himself to leave. The radiator beneath the far window had stopped working an hour ago, but it continued to tick as the metal cooled. A slow, irregular sound, like a clock that had given up trying to keep time. The hallway outside was silent. The janitor had not yet reached this floor. The only smell was the one that always lived in this room. Floor polish and dry paper, and the faint, chalky residue of lessons that had been written and erased and written again, so many times that the blackboard had a permanent grey haze, as if it were tired of holding words. He sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface. His fingers were cold. The wood was cold. Everything in the room was slowly losing its warmth, and he was sitting in the middle of it, replaying the day. It had not been a bad day. That was the strange thing. No one had yelled. No one had cried. No parent had called to complain. He had taught his lessons. He had answered questions. He had helped a girl in the third row who was struggling with a problem. She was embarrassed to admit she did not understand. He had done, by any reasonable measure, a perfectly adequate job, but the voice did not deal in reasonable measures. The voice dealt in the distance between what he had done and what he should have done. It replayed the moment he had hesitated before answering a student's question. The hesitation had lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but in the replay, it stretched into an eternity of incompetence. It replayed the joke he had made, that landed flat, the silence afterward, the way one student had looked at another, with an expression he could not read. It replayed the lesson plan he had prepared the night before, and all the ways it had fallen short of what he had imagined. You should have been clearer. You should have been more patient. You should have been someone else. He was still sitting there, hands flat on the cold desk, when the janitor appeared in the doorway. She was an older woman, 60, maybe 65, with a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. She wore a blue smock that was too large for her and shoes that squeaked on the polished floor. She had been cleaning this school for almost 20 years, and she moved through it the way water moves through a familiar riverbed, without hesitation, without thought, following a path worn smooth by repetition. She looked at him sitting alone in the dark classroom and set the bucket down. "Still here," she said. "Still here." "You are always still here." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. "I am just going over the day." "Going over it," she repeated, leaning on the mop handle. "Or going over yourself." He looked up. She was watching him with an expression he had seen before, on the faces of people who have lived long enough to recognize a familiar kind of suffering, not because they have studied it, but because they have worn it themselves. "I went to school here," she said. "Did you know that? 40 years ago. Sat in a room just like this one, 2 floors up. I had a teacher who told me I would never amount to anything. She said it in front of the whole class. I was 11. He did not say anything. The radiator ticked. I carried that sentence around for 30 years, she continued. 30 years. I heard it when I applied for jobs. I heard it when I tried to learn something new. I heard it when my daughter brought home good grades. and I thought, she must get it from her father. 30 years of a voice that was not even mine. She picked up the bucket and moved it closer to the door. Pema Chodron, you know her, Buddhist nun, American. She said something once that I read on a calendar in a dentist's waiting room, of all places. She said that the most difficult times for many of us are the ones we give ourselves. I sat in that waiting room and read it 3 times. And I thought, is exactly right. The teacher who said I would never amount to anything said it once, on one afternoon, in one classroom, but I said it to myself every day for 30 years. She gave me the sentence. I gave it its power. She looked at him. So, the voice in your head right now, the one that is telling you the day was not good enough. Whose voice is it? Is it yours? Or is it someone else's? Someone who said something a long time ago, and you have been repeating it ever since, like a song you cannot get out of your head. He sat with that question. The radiator ticked. The chalk dust settled. The streetlight outside the window had come on, casting long shadows of the desk legs across the floor, parallel lines stretching toward the door, like paths leading out of a room he had not realized he was locked in. He did not have an answer. But the question itself had shifted something. The way a window shifts the air in a room when you open it, even just a crack. He did not know whose voice it was. He was not sure he had ever asked, and the not knowing felt, for the first time, less like ignorance and more like the beginning of something. The janitor squeezed the mop and began to clean the floor, starting at the far corner and working her way toward him with slow, steady strokes. The wet floor gleamed in the streetlight. She hummed something he did not recognize. A tune without urgency, without destination, the kind of sound a person makes when they have finally stopped arguing with themselves. What the janitor was pointing to, and what the young teacher was beginning to hear, is one of the oldest observations in the Buddhist tradition. Not a commandment, not a rule, simply a noticing that the mind has a habit of taking a single thought and building an entire world around it. The Buddha had a word for this, papanka. It means something like mental proliferation, the tendency of the mind to take one small seed of doubt and grow it into a forest so thick you cannot see your way out. Someone says a careless word. The mind takes that word and turns it into a story. The story becomes a belief. The belief becomes a voice. And the voice becomes so familiar that you mistake it for the truth. Zen Master Dogen once wrote, simply and without decoration, do not follow the ideas of others, but learn to listen to the voice within yourself. Not the voice that criticizes, not the voice that judges, but the voice beneath those voices. The one that has been waiting, quiet and patient, for you to stop listening to everyone else long enough to hear it. Tonight, lying here, you may recognize that voice, the one that is not yours. You may have heard it earlier today, or yesterday, or every day for as long as you can remember. It may sound like a parent. It may sound like a teacher. It may sound like a friend who said something in passing that lodged itself beneath your skin and never came out. Or it may sound like your own voice, because after years of repetition, borrowed words begin to feel like native ones. But here is something worth considering as you lie here tonight. There was a time before that voice arrived. There was a version of you, very young, very small, who had not yet learned to criticize herself, who had not yet been taught that she was too much or not enough. That version of you did not need to be fixed. She was not broken. She was simply a child, lying in the dark, breathing, wondering about the world, feeling no gap between who she was and who she was supposed to be. The voice came later. It was given to you, and anything that was given to you can, in time, be set down. In a kitchen at the far end of a quiet street, in a house where the garden had long ago stopped apologizing for its wildness. An old woman was making bread. She had been making bread every morning for more years than she could count. So many years that her hands knew the work before her mind arrived. The flour was already on the wooden board when she came downstairs. The yeast was already dissolving in the warm water on the counter. The oven was heating itself with a low, steady hum that made the whole kitchen feel like the inside of a sleeping animal. Her hands were weathered, not the smooth weathering of someone who has been careful, but the deep, cracked weathering of someone who has used them without apology. Flour settled into the creases of her knuckles and along the lines of her palms, turning them white as a winter road. The kitchen window had fogged from the warmth of the rising dough, and through the condensation, the garden outside appeared as a blur of green and grey, shapeless, patient, alive. The cat was sleeping on the wooden chair beside the table, curled into a circle so perfect it looked like a drawing of a cat rather than an actual one. From somewhere in another room, a radio played something she was not listening to. Just sound, just company. Just proof that the world outside this kitchen was still turning. She kneaded the dough and remembered, not on purpose. The hands did their work, and the mind, with nothing else to do, wandered backward. She remembered being 25 and standing in front of a mirror, cataloguing flaws. Not thin enough, not smart enough, not calm enough. She remembered her mother's voice, a woman who had meant well, but who had her own list, her own inherited voice, and who passed it down the way you pass down a coat through generations. Not because it fits, but because it is the only one you have. She remembered teachers who frowned when she spoke too loudly, friends who looked away when she laughed too hard. A husband who once said, gently and without cruelty, that she might try being a little less intense. And she remembered the night. She could not recall the year, only the season, which was winter, when she was lying awake, running through the list again, and she suddenly heard the voice, as if from a great distance, as if someone had turned down the volume just enough for her to notice that it was not coming from inside her at all. It was coming from somewhere behind her, from the past, from the people who had shaped her, from the air of every room she had ever been made to feel too small in. It was not her voice. It had never been her voice. It was an inheritance, a hand-me-down conviction worn so long it had taken the shape of her body, and she had mistaken it for skin. She did not defeat the voice that night. She did not silence it or argue it into submission. She simply noticed, for the first time, that it was separate from her, that she could hear it the way you hear rain on a roof, present, real, but not inside the house. Jack Cornfield, a teacher who spent years in monasteries in Thailand and Burma before returning to America to teach, once said that much of spiritual life is self-acceptance. Maybe all of it. She had read that sentence in a book she found at a second-hand shop, and she had carried it with her the way you carry a stone in your pocket, not because it is useful, but because the weight of it reminds you of something you do not want to forget. Self-acceptance was not a moment of triumph. It was not a breakthrough on a mountaintop. It was this: a woman in a kitchen, making bread, remembering who she used to be, and feeling at last no distance between that woman and the one standing here now, with flour on her hands and warmth in the room and the cat asleep and the radio playing something she was not listening to. She shaped the dough into a round loaf and placed it in the oven. The door closed with a soft click. The kitchen filled with the beginning of a smell that would take an hour to finish. Warm, yeasty, alive. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood by the foggy window and watched the garden slowly appear as the morning light grew stronger. The cat stretched, rearranging itself without opening its eyes. The bread rose in the dark of the oven, and she stood there, needing nothing, regretting nothing, being no one other than a woman making bread at dawn. The light at the window changed from grey to gold so slowly that she could not have told you the moment it happened. It simply arrived, the way peace arrives, not with an announcement, but with the quiet realization that the war is over and has been over for some time. A student once came to a Zen master and asked, with great seriousness, "What is wrong with me?" The master said nothing. He reached behind him and picked up a small mirror, the kind you might find on a dresser, plain and unadorned, and held it up so the student could see his own face. The student looked at his reflection. He saw his own eyes looking back at him, his own mouth, his own skin. Nothing remarkable, nothing extraordinary, just a face. "I have been looking," the master said, "and I see nothing wrong here." The student wanted to argue. He had come with a list, a long list, carefully prepared, full of evidence, but the mirror did not argue back. It simply showed him what was there, and what was there was a face. Not a perfect face, not a flawed face, just a face. The face of someone who had walked a long way to ask a question that had already been answered by the asking. What if the voice in your head, the one that reviews and revises and finds you wanting, is not a voice you need to obey? What if you could hear it the way you hear a sound from another room? Present, real, yes, but not in charge. Not the authority it has always claimed to be, but simply a sound. An old sound. A sound that belongs to another time and another room and another version of you that no longer needs its protection. Perhaps, right now, if a thought arises that says, "You should be doing something other than lying here. You should be solving something, fixing something, planning tomorrow, worrying about yesterday." Perhaps you can simply notice that thought, the way you would notice a bird landing on a branch outside your window. You see it. You hear it. You do not need to become it. You do not need to follow it. You can simply lie here, breathing, letting the thought be a thought, and nothing more. The bird will fly away when it is ready. The thought will pass when it has finished passing, and you will still be here, unchanged, unhurt, whole. And perhaps that is enough for now. Let your breath come slowly. Let the quiet hold you. Notice what has softened in the last few minutes. In your shoulders, in your chest, in the space behind your eyes. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is something else that moves through us in the dark. Not a voice this time, but a feeling. It arrives without warning, stays without permission, and leaves when it is ready. And feelings, as we are about to discover, are not quite what we think they are. There is something else that moves through us in the dark. Not a voice this time, but a feeling. It arrives without warning, stays without permission, and leaves when it is ready, not when we are ready. And feelings, as we are about to discover, are not quite what we think they are. Let your breath settle. Let your body be still. And let us go now to a lake before dawn, where a man is sitting alone in a boat, waiting for something he cannot name. The lake was one of those places that existed differently, depending on the hour. In the afternoon, with sunlight on the surface and children calling from the far shore, it was cheerful. A postcard, a photograph someone would take and send to a friend. But before dawn, when the world was still deciding whether to wake up, the lake was something else entirely. It was private, it was enormous, and it was covered in a mist so thick and low that it sat on the water like a cloth someone had draped across a table, hiding everything beneath it. The fisherman's boat was small, wooden, flat-bottomed, the kind of boat that had been repaired so many times There was almost nothing left of the original. The oarlocks creaked when he rowed, a rhythmic sound that was half music and half complaint, and the oars left brief, dark wounds in the surface of the water that healed themselves almost immediately. He had been coming to this lake every morning for 3 months. Not to fish, though he brought a rod and a tackle box, because a man in a boat without a rod invites questions he does not want to answer. He came because the lake was the only place where the feeling in his chest did not seem quite so heavy. Or perhaps it was just as heavy. But here, with the mist and the silence, and the water stretching out in every direction, there was more room for it. The feeling had a name, though he did not like to use it. It was shame. Shame over an argument with his son, an argument that had started over something so small he could no longer remember what it was. A comment at dinner, a tone of voice, and then the escalation, fast and ugly, the way arguments between people who love each other always are. Because you know exactly where the other person is most tender, and in the heat of the moment you go there anyway. He had said something he heard himself say as if from outside his own body. And even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were wrong, knew they were cruel, knew they could not be taken back. His son had gone quiet. Not the quiet of someone who has lost an argument, but the quiet of someone who has been hit in a place they did not think they needed to protect. That had been 3 months ago. They had not spoken since. And every morning, the fisherman came to the lake and sat in the boat and carried the shame the way you carry a stone in your chest. Not because you want to, but because you do not know how to put it down. He had begun to believe the shame was who he was, not a feeling that had arrived, a thing with a beginning and, presumably, an end, but a permanent condition. I am an angry man. I am a bad father. I am the kind of person who says things like that. The feeling had settled into his identity, the way silt settles to the bottom of a lake, and he could no longer tell where the shame ended and he began. He dipped his hand into the water. It was cold, sharply, almost painfully cold, and the sensation traveled up his wrist and into his forearm like a small electric current. He held his hand there for a moment, feeling the temperature, and when he pulled it out, the water dripped from his knuckles and made tiny circles on the surface that expanded outward and disappeared. And then the weather changed. It came from the far end of the lake, a squall, moving fast, pushing a line of dark water ahead of it, like a broom sweeping a floor. The wind hit the boat first, rocking it sideways, and then the rain arrived, sudden, hard, almost angry. The surface of the lake went from glass to chaos in less than a minute. Waves slapped against the hull, the mist tore apart. The sky, which had been the color of ash, turned the color of iron. He pulled his collar up and ducked his head and waited. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps less, and then it passed, moved across the lake and over the far ridge, and took its noise with it. The way a train takes its noise when it has gone through a station without stopping. The water flattened, the waves shrank back to ripples, and the ripples shrank back to nothing, and the lake was still again. Not the same stillness as before, but a stillness that felt earned, the way silence feels different after a loud sound. And then the fog came. Not the same fog that had been there before dawn, but a new fog, thinner, softer, rising from the water itself, as if the lake were breathing out after holding its breath. It moved slowly across the surface, unhurried, almost gentle, and it wrapped around the boat and erased the shoreline, and left him sitting in a white room with no walls. 3 weathers in one morning: storm, stillness, fog. 3 completely different skies, 3 completely different moods, passing through the same air above the same water. The lake had not become the storm. The lake had not become the fog. It had held them, all of them, the way a bowl holds water, without becoming the water, without being damaged by what passed through it. He sat in the boat, with the oar resting across the gunwales, water dripping slowly from the blade. The pine trees on the far shore were beginning to emerge from the fog, dark and patient, smelling of resin and rain. And he understood, not in the way you understand an idea, but in the way you understand a temperature, a weight, a taste, that the anger had been weather. Real, yes. Powerful, yes. But it had passed through him the way the squall had passed through the morning. It was not the sky. It was never the sky. He was the sky, and the sky was still here after the storm, unchanged, unbroken, wide enough to hold whatever came next. The water settled. A fish broke the surface somewhere to his left. A single splash, a single ripple expanding outward in a perfect circle. And then the lake was quiet again. And so was he. You know this too. The way an emotion can fill you so completely that it feels like the whole of you. The way sadness can feel, not like something you are experiencing, but like something you have become. The way anger can seem permanent, like a stain that has soaked all the way through. We say, I am sad, or I am anxious, as if the emotion and the self were the same thing, as if you could not separate the weather from the sky. Thich Nhat Hanh, who spent most of his life teaching people how to be present with what they feel, once offered a gentle observation. He said that feelings, whether of compassion or irritation, should be welcomed, recognized, and treated on an absolutely equal basis, because both are ourselves, not one more real than the other, not one more worthy. The sadness and the joy, the anger and the calm, the shame and the tenderness, all of them are weather, all of them pass through, and none of them are the sky. Tonight, if there is a feeling sitting in your chest that you have been trying to push away, or a feeling you have been holding so tightly that your hands have cramped around it, you do not need to do anything about it. You do not need to fix it or understand it or make it go away. You can simply notice it, the way the fisherman noticed the squall, and know that it is moving, even when it does not feel like it is moving. Everything moves. That is perhaps the most reliable truth there is. There is a river not far from here. Or perhaps it is far from here. Perhaps it is nowhere in particular, which is the best kind of place for a river to be. And on the morning after a heavy storm, this river runs brown, not the gentle brown of tea or honey, but the thick, turbid brown of mud and clay, and everything the rain has pulled from the hillsides and washed into the current. Branches float past, leaves torn from their trees before they were ready. Small stones roll along the riverbed, with a sound like knuckles dragged across a table. The water is so full of debris that you cannot see the bottom, cannot see even your own hand if you dip it beneath the surface. If you stood on the bank and watched, you might think, this river is ruined, this river is dirty, this river is broken. But if you came back that evening, if you walked the same path and stood on the same bank and looked at the same river, you would see something else entirely. The water would be running clear, not perfectly clear, perhaps, still carrying the faintest blush of clay, the last memory of the storm, but clear enough to see the stones on the bottom, clear enough to watch a fish hold itself steady against the current, clear enough to reflect the sky. No one cleaned the river. No one stood upstream with a filter and sorted the mud from the water. No one fixed it. The river simply carried what it carried, for as long as it needed to carry it, and then it let it go. The mud settled. The branches washed ashore. The water returned to what it had always been. Not because it was trying to return, but because clarity is what water does when you stop adding things to it. The river did not become the mud. It never does. On the second floor of a hospital that never fully sleeps, there is a garden, not a large garden, just a square of grass between two wings of the building, with a wooden bench and a hedge that no one trims often enough, and a single light above the back door that attracts moths all summer long. During the day, patients sit here sometimes, or their families, blinking in the sunlight as if they have surfaced from deep water. But at 2 in the morning, the garden belongs to the night shift. She was sitting on the bench in her scrubs, which were damp from the grass she had walked through to reach it. The fluorescent light from the ward windows fell across the lawn in pale rectangles, turning the wet grass into something that looked almost silver. Night insects pulsed in the hedgerow, a steady, rhythmic sound, mechanical and alive at the same time, like a heartbeat heard through a wall. The air smelled different out here. Inside, it smelled of antiseptic and recycled warmth and the particular staleness of a building that has been breathing the same air for decades. Out here, it smelled of wet earth and something green and growing. The hedge, maybe, or the grass, or just the night itself, which has its own smell, if you are quiet enough to notice it. She was holding a cup of tea from the vending machine. It had been hot 10 minutes ago. Now it was the temperature of her hands, which was the temperature of someone who has been working for 9 hours and has stopped noticing whether she is warm or cold. She had lost a patient tonight. Not lost. That was the word they used, as if the patient had been misplaced, as if someone might find her later in another room. The woman had died, quietly, without drama, the way people sometimes do in hospitals at night. A slow fading, a last breath that was only recognizable as the last breath because no other breath followed it. She had been fond of this patient. She had braided her hair 2 days ago when the woman's hands had become too weak to do it herself. She was crying, not loudly, not the way people cry in movies. She was crying the way people cry at 2 in the morning, when they are very tired and very alone, and something in them has finally opened that they have been trying to keep closed. The tears ran down her face, and she did not wipe them away, because her hands were holding the cup, and the cup was the only warm thing she had. The door behind her opened and closed. Footsteps on wet grass. The bench creaked as someone sat down beside her. She did not look up. She knew who it was. One of the other nurses. A man who had been working nights for 30 years. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from a material harder than skin. Not unkind, just durable, the way certain rocks are durable. He sat beside her and said nothing for a long time. The insects pulsed. The light hummed. A moth circled the lamp above the door. "I feel everything," she said finally without looking at him. "Every patient, every loss. I take it home with me. I think something is wrong with me." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Nothing is wrong with you. Then why does it hurt this much?" "Because you are paying attention. That is not a flaw. That is what makes you good at this." She shook her head. "But how do you do it? 30 years. How are you still here?" He leaned back on the bench and looked at the sky, which was black and starless above the hospital lights. "I stopped trying not to feel," he said. "That was the thing. For years I tried to build a wall, to separate myself from the patients, to stay professional, to keep the sadness on the other side of the glass. And it worked for a while. But the wall kept everything out, not just the pain but the meaning too. So I took it down. And I learned something." He turned to look at her. "You are the room the sadness passes through. You are not the sadness itself. The feelings come. They stay for a while. Sometimes they stay longer than you think you can bear, and then they leave. My job, my only job, is to leave the door open in both directions, to let them in and to let them go." She looked at the cup in her hands. The tea was completely cold now. Pema Chodron, who is a Buddhist nun and a teacher, she once said that nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know. He continued, I think that is true. I think the sadness you are feeling right now is teaching you something. I do not know what it is. You may not know for a long time. But it is not here to destroy you. It is here because you cared, and caring has a cost, and the cost is worth paying. They sat together. The tea went cold, then past cold, into that state where temperature is no longer relevant, because you have forgotten you are holding anything at all. The insects kept their rhythm. The moth found the light and lost it and found it again. She did not feel better, not exactly. But she felt less alone in the feeling, and that, for tonight, for this bench, for this hour, for these two people sitting in a garden that belonged to the night, was enough. The fluorescent light fell across them both, casting their shadows long across the wet grass, and neither one needed the other to say anything more. They simply sat, two people in the presence of a feeling that would, eventually, in its own time, pass. Perhaps right now, lying here, there is a feeling you have been carrying. Maybe it arrived today. Maybe it has been with you for weeks, or months, or longer. And perhaps you have been treating it the way we often treat unwelcome guests, ignoring it, resisting it, wishing it away, telling yourself you should not feel what you feel. But the Buddha noticed something very precise about feelings. So precise that he gave it a name in Pali. He called it Vedana, the feeling tone, not the emotion itself, with all its stories and reasons and justifications, but the first, raw flash that comes before the story begins. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, just that, just a tone, a temperature, a texture, and between that first flash and the story your mind builds around it. The story that says, I am sad, I am broken, this will never end. There is a gap, a small quiet gap, no wider than a breath, and in that gap you are free. Not free from the feeling, free from the story about the feeling. Free to feel what you feel without becoming it. You do not need to find that gap tonight. You do not need to practice anything. Just know that it is there, the way you know a door is there, even when it is closed. And if you notice right now a feeling moving through you, any feeling, pleasant or unpleasant, see if you can feel just the raw sensation of it. Not the name, not the reason, just the texture, the weight, the temperature, the way it sits in your body, nothing more. Zen Master Dogen wrote, with the kind of simplicity that takes a lifetime to earn. A flower falls, even though we love it, and a weed grows, even though we do not love it. This is not a tragedy. This is simply the way things move. Feelings fall, feelings grow, and you who are lying here, breathing, listening, still whole after everything you have felt today, and yesterday and the day before that, you are the ground they move through. Not the flower, not the weed, the ground. Let that be enough for now. Let your breath slow. Let the quiet settle around you, like fog settling on a lake. Soft, unhurried, asking nothing. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is one more habit the mind carries, quieter than the critic, subtler than any emotion. And it is the habit of looking sideways at the life someone else is living, and believing that life should be yours. There is one more habit the mind carries, quieter than the critic, subtler than any emotion. And it is the habit of looking sideways, looking at the life someone else is living and believing, with a certainty that sits like a stone in the stomach, that their life should be yours. Let your breath settle. Let the quiet find you again, and let us sit with this habit for a while. Not to judge it, but to see it clearly, perhaps for the first time. You know the feeling. You may have felt it today. The strange, specific pain of watching someone else succeed at the thing you have been struggling with. The hollow sensation of scrolling through images of a life that looks polished and purposeful, while yours feels scattered and uncertain. The quiet arithmetic of comparison, measuring your insides against someone else's outside, your rough draft against their finished product, your Tuesday against their best day. It happens so quickly, so automatically, that you rarely notice the moment it begins. 1 second you are yourself. The next, you are yourself measured against someone else. And the measurement always comes out the same. Not enough. 2 monks were once asked to carry stones to the top of a mountain. The stones were roughly the same size, heavy, awkward, the kind of burden that requires you to shift your grip every few steps. They began walking at dawn. The path was steep and narrow, and the morning was cold, and neither of them spoke for the first hour. But the first monk could not stop watching the second. He watched the way the other man held his stone. Was it lighter? Was his grip more natural? He watched the other man's step. Was it steadier, less labored? Did the path seem easier under his feet? He watched the other man's face for signs of strain, and found none, and the absence of strain became its own kind of torment. With every step, the first monk carried 2 burdens, the stone in his arms and the watching in his mind. By the time he reached the top, he was exhausted, not from the weight of what he carried, but from the weight of measuring. The second monk set his stone down and sat on the grass, and looked out at the valley below. He was tired, yes. His arms ached and his legs were heavy, but he was only tired from the climb. He had not noticed the first monk's stone. He had not thought to compare. He had watched the path, and the path had been enough. The first monk sat down beside him, breathing hard, and asked, "Was your stone lighter than mine?" The second monk looked at him with genuine confusion. "I do not know," he said. "I was not carrying yours." In a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had been built for people who did not need much space, a young man sat on the edge of his unmade bed and stared at an open instrument case. The case was old, black, scuffed at the corners, lined with velvet that had worn thin in the shape of the instrument it held. The instrument itself, a cello, lay inside it, like something resting, or like something that had been put away and forgotten, which is not the same thing at all. The apartment was small enough that you could see every corner of it from the bed. Sheet music lay scattered across the floor, pages he had printed, pages he had marked up with pencil, pages he had crumpled and then smoothed out again because he could not afford to reprint them. A streetlight outside the window cast a single orange stripe across the far wall, and the stripe moved slightly when cars passed below, as if the light itself were restless. The radiator beneath the window hummed, a low, uneven sound, like a conversation happening in a language he almost understood. The floorboards were cold under his bare feet. There was a mug of coffee on the windowsill that had been sitting there long enough to develop a skin on its surfaces, and the smell of it, stale and slightly bitter, mixed with the smell of the street below, which was the smell of exhaust and rain, and the particular dampness of a city at night. He had come home from a performance. Not his performance. He had been in the audience. A musician his age, someone he had gone to school with, had played that evening. And the playing had been, the word that kept coming back was effortless. The bow moved across the strings, as if it were not being moved at all, but simply allowed. The notes arrived without hesitation, without apology, without the small, almost invisible moments of doubt that he recognized in his own, playing the way you recognize your own handwriting. Not because it is beautiful, but because it is yours. He had applauded, he had smiled, He had said the right things afterward. And then he had come home and sat on the bed and opened his phone and scrolled through the congratulations, the praise, the reviews, the photographs of someone else holding a bow that seemed to belong in their hands in a way his never quite did. And the feeling had arrived, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow, heavy certainty of water filling a basement. I am not good enough. I will never be good enough. There are people in this world who have what I do not have, and no amount of practice will close the distance between us. He was still sitting there when he heard the knock. Not on his door, on the wall, the thin wall that separated his apartment from the one next door, where an elderly woman lived alone. She was blind, had been blind for many years, and they had developed, over the months he had lived here, a quiet friendship built on proximity and thin walls. She knocked when she needed something. He knocked when he had made too much food. They had never once sat in the same room together. "Are you there?" she called through the wall. Her voice was clear but distant, like a voice heard across water. "I am here," he said. "You are not playing tonight." "No, you always play when you come home, even late. I hear you through the wall. I wait for it." He looked at the cello in its case. "I went to a concert tonight," he said. "Someone I know. He was very good." A pause. "And now you think you are not?" He did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. "I have been listening to you practice for 7 months," she said. "Through this wall. Every scale. Every piece. Every time you stop and start again. Because something was not right. I cannot see your face when you play. I cannot see your hands. I can only hear what comes through." And what comes through? The most honest sound I have ever heard. He shook his head, even though she could not see him. "But there are better players. Much better. You should hear." "I cannot see better," she said, and her voice was patient and kind and entirely without pity. "I can only hear what is true, and what you play is true. It sounds like someone who is not pretending. I do not know what the other man sounded like tonight, but I know what you sound like every evening when you think no one is listening, and it is the sound of someone who means it." He sat with that. The radiator hummed. The streetlight shifted. Pema Chodron once wrote that as long as our orientation is toward perfection or success, we will never learn about unconditional friendship with ourselves. He had been orienting toward the other musicians, playing the way a compass orients, toward north, automatically, without choice, without questioning whether north was where he needed to go. And in the turning, he had lost the direction of his own sound. Not a better sound, not a worse sound, just his sound, the one that came through the wall to a woman who could not see, but who could hear, with perfect clarity, the difference between performance and truth. The apartment was quiet. She had stopped talking. He reached out and touched the neck of the cello, not to play it, just to feel it. The wood was cool and smooth under his fingers, shaped by someone else's hands long ago, but worn now into the particular curves of his grip. He was not the best. He knew that. He would never be the best. And something about that tonight, with the streetlight moving on the wall, and the radiator humming its uneven song, and the coffee going cold, and the neighbor going quiet on the other side of the thin wall, felt less like a wound and more like a door. A door he had not noticed before, because he had been too busy looking through someone else's window. He did not play. Not yet. He just sat on the edge of the bed, one hand on the instrument, the other resting on the scattered sheet music, and let the apartment hold him the way a room holds a person who has finally stopped trying to be in a different room. We live in a world that has turned comparison into a reflex, a twitch of the mind so fast we mistake it for seeing, But comparison is not seeing clearly. It is seeing selectively. It is choosing to look at someone else's best moment and setting it beside your worst. It is comparing your rough draft to their published book, your first attempt to their 10th, your private struggle to their public ease. And the comparison always leaves out the most important thing. You are not seeing their life. You are seeing the part of their life they have chosen to show you. Shunryu Suzuki, who spent his life teaching people how to begin again, once said that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. The moment you begin to measure, to rank, to compare, to place yourself on a ladder, the possibilities shrink. The music becomes a competition. The painting becomes a contest. The life becomes a scorecard. And the beginner's mind, which was wide and open and full of directions you had not yet imagined, narrows into a single question. Am I winning or losing? That question has no good answer, because the game is one you invented, and the rules are ones you made up, and the other player does not even know they are playing. In a studio halfway up a mountain, where the air was thin and cold and carried the smell of pine resin and distant snow, a woman sat before a low table with a brush in her hand. The inkstone was already wet. She had ground the ink that morning in the old way. With water from a jar she kept on the windowsill, turning the stick slowly against the stone until the liquid was the color of a midnight sky. The rice paper lay flat on the table, slightly curled at the edges, waiting with the particular patience of something that knows it is about to be changed. She had been a painter for 30 years, but for the first 20 of those years, she had not been her own painter. She had been a student of a man whose brushwork was famous, celebrated in galleries, reproduced in books, imitated by a generation of younger artists who studied the way his lines moved across paper, the way astronomers study the movement of stars. She had been one of those students. She had spent 2 decades trying to make her hand move the way his hand moved, trying to produce lines that had his particular combination of strength and restraint, his ability to suggest a mountain with a single stroke, a river with a curve so subtle it barely existed. The mountain view through the open screen was half obscured by mist. The peaks appeared and disappeared as the clouds moved through the valley below, as if the landscape itself were breathing. A bird called from somewhere in the trees outside. A single high note repeated at intervals, and the cold morning air moved through the room and across the paper and raised the fine hairs on the backs of her hands. And then, one morning, an ordinary morning, a morning that began with ink and water and paper and nothing special, her brush slipped. A line she had never intended appeared on the paper, thick where it should have been thin, curved where it should have been straight, a mark that violated every principle her teacher had taught her, every standard she had internalized, every rule she had spent 20 years obeying. She almost crumpled the paper. Her hand moved toward it automatically, the way you move to correct a mistake before anyone sees it. But something stopped her. She looked at the line. It was wrong. By every measure she knew it was wrong, but it was also alive. It moved the way her hand moved, not the way her teacher's hand moved, but the way hers did, with its own particular rhythm, its own weight, its own way of arriving at the paper. It was not a better line. It was not a worse line. It was a true line, and she recognized, with a shock that felt like stepping into cold water, that she had never seen a true line of her own before. She had only ever seen imitations of someone else's truth. The Buddha had a word for the habit she had been caught in. He called it mana, which means something like conceit, but not in the way we usually use that word. Mana is the mind's habit of measuring, not just measuring yourself, against others, but measuring in all directions. I am better than, I am worse than, I am equal to. The measuring itself is the suffering, not the result of the measurement, but the act of measuring. Because as long as you are measuring, you are not here. You are somewhere between yourself and someone else, suspended in a space that does not actually exist. Zen Master Dogen, who understood this perhaps better than anyone, once wrote, "If you cannot find the truth right where you are, where else do you expect to find it?" She had spent 20 years looking for the truth in her teacher's brushstroke. The truth had been in her own hand the whole time. In the slip, in the mistake, in the line that did not follow the rules, in the thing she almost destroyed because it did not look like someone else's work. She dips the brush in ink now, this morning, this ordinary morning, and touches it to paper. The stroke that comes out is not perfect. It does not look like anything her teacher would have painted. It curves in a way that is hers alone, with a weight that belongs to her hand and no one else's. The ink settles into the paper. The mountain light shifts. The brush rests in the water jar afterward, and the ink disperses in slow, dark clouds, like a secret dissolving into something larger than itself. And the paper holds what it holds. Not a perfect line, not an imperfect line, but a true one. And that is the only thing it ever needed to be. Perhaps tonight you can let go of the measuring, just for now, just for this hour, just for the length of this breath. You are not being compared to anyone right now. No one is watching. No one is keeping score. There is no ranking of sleepers, no leaderboard of rest. Your breath is not competing with anyone else's breath. Your rest is not being graded. Your body already knows this. It has known it all along. The heart does not compare itself to other hearts. The lungs do not wonder whether they are breathing as well as someone else's lungs. The blood moves through you without asking permission, without consulting a standard, without checking to see whether it is doing it right. The body knows how to rest without measuring itself against other bodies. It has been doing this since the night you were born, when you lay in the dark for the first time, breathing, needing nothing, comparing nothing, being no one other than exactly who you were. That is still available to you. It has never left, and perhaps that is enough. Let the measuring rest. Let the breath come slowly. Let the quiet settle, the way ink settles in a jar of water, softly, darkly, without effort. When you are ready, we will continue together. And if comparison is one weight we carry, there is another that may be heavier still. The things we have done that we have not yet forgiven ourselves for. The words we said. The moments we wish we could undo. The past we carry into every room, hoping no one will notice. And if comparison is one weight we carry, there is another that may be heavier still. The things we have done that we have not yet forgiven ourselves for. The words we said that landed harder than we intended. The moments we wish we could undo. The past we carry into every room, hoping no one will notice, and then lying awake at night, wondering if they did. Take a breath, let it out slowly, and let us go now to a barn in winter, where a man is working with his hands, trying to mend something that is not a chair. The barn had been his father's before it was his, and his grandfather's before that. And the wood in the walls had darkened over the decades, until it was nearly the color of earth. Sawdust covered every surface, the workbench, the floor, the window ledge, the old radio that no longer played, a fine, pale dust that looked, in the right light, like snow that had found its way indoors and decided to stay. The air was cold, not the sharp, bright cold of open fields, but the still, close cold of an enclosed space that has not been heated properly in years. The kind of cold that settles into your knuckles and stays there, patient and heavy, until you forget it is cold, and begin to think it is simply the way your hands feel now. He worked by the light of a single bare bulb that hung from a beam on a wire too long for it, so that it swung slightly whenever the wind found the gaps in the barn walls. And the wind always found the gaps. The shadows moved when the bulb moved, shifting across the pegboard where the tools hung in rows: chisels, hand planes, rasps, a coping saw with a blade so thin it looked like a strand of hair. Some of the tools were rusted. He had not used them all in years, but he kept them there because they had belonged to his father, and throwing them away would have felt like throwing away a conversation he was not finished having. The smell was pine shavings and machine oil and something older. The accumulated scent of decades of wood being cut and shaped and sanded. A smell that lived in the walls themselves and came out when the air was cold, as if the barn were remembering all the things that had been made inside it. His breath was visible, small clouds that formed in front of his face and dissolved before they reached the bulb. He watched them sometimes the way you watch thoughts, appearing, dissolving, appearing again. He was working on a chair, not his chair. A woman from the next town had brought it in that morning, carried it through the barn door in both arms, the way you carry something precious and broken, which is to say carefully, and with apology. One leg was cracked. The seat had split along the grain, a clean line running from the front edge to the back, and the whole chair leaned to the left when you set it down, as if it were tired and looking for somewhere to rest. He turned it over on the workbench and examined the crack. It ran deeper than he expected, not just through the surface but almost through the entire leg. A fracture that had been widening slowly, invisibly, for years, until the day it finally gave way. He ran his thumb along it. The wood inside the crack was lighter than the wood outside, pale and raw, the color of something that has not been exposed to air in a long time. This might not hold, he said, more to himself than to her. She was standing by the door, arms crossed, watching him work. "I don't want a new chair," she said. "I'm not sure I can save this one. It was my mother's." He stopped, looked at her. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that suggested she had spent more time outdoors than indoors, and her eyes had the steadiness of someone who had already made her peace with the hard parts. "The crack doesn't ruin it," she said. "It just means it was used. It was lived in. My mother sat in that chair every evening for 30 years. She read in it. She fell asleep in it. She held me in it when I was small enough to be held. The crack is not a flaw. It is 30 years of someone being alive." He looked at the chair. He looked at the crack, and he heard, beneath her words, something she was not saying. Something that was not about the chair at all, but about the crack running through his own life. The one he had been carrying for 4 years, without telling anyone. The one that had split him from his daughter, the way the grain had split the seat. He had said something to her. His daughter. Something during an argument. The kind of argument that starts over dishes, or schedules, or money, and ends somewhere you never intended to go. He had said something about her choices, about the life she was building, and he had said it in his father's voice, not the gentle voice his father used when they worked together in this barn, but the other voice, the hard one, the one that came out when something was not up to standard. And she had looked at him the way wood looks the moment before it splits, holding, and then not holding. That was 4 years ago. She had not called. He had not called. The crack between them was not clean like the one in the chair. It was jagged, and it ran deep, and he did not know if it went all the way through. Jack Cornfield, who spent years as a monk in the forests of Thailand before returning to America to teach, once said that if your compassion does not include yourself, It is incomplete. The carpenter had heard this somewhere. A book, a radio program, a waiting room, and it had lodged in him the way a splinter lodges under the skin. He had compassion for his customers, for their broken chairs and wobbly tables, and the things they could not bear to throw away. He had compassion for the woman standing in his doorway, holding the memory of her mother. He had compassion for almost everyone who walked through the barn door, but not for himself, never for himself. The crack in his own life he treated not with glue and clamps and patience, the way he would treat a chair, but with silence and avoidance, and the quiet daily punishment of replaying the moment, and finding himself guilty every time. He repaired the chair. He used hide glue, the old kind, the kind his father used, the kind that smells of heat and animal, and something ancient. He clamped the leg and braced the seat and let the glue set overnight. And when the woman came back the next morning, the chair was whole again. Not perfect. You could see where the mend was, a faint line, a slight change in color, the ghost of the break, preserved in the repair. He had not hidden it. There was no point in hiding it. The chair had cracked. It had been mended. Both things were true. She took the chair home. He stood in the barn alone, in the cold, in the sawdust-filtered light of the single swinging bulb. He looked at his own hands, scarred across the knuckles, calloused at the base of every finger, stained with glue and oil, and the particular darkness that comes from years of working with walnut and oak. These were hands that had built things and broken things. Hands that had held tools, and held his daughter when she was small, and held the phone he could not bring himself to pick up. They were not clean hands. They were not perfect hands. They were the only hands he had. The barn door was open. Winter light fell across the workbench in a single white beam, and the sawdust floated in it, turning slowly, catching the light, drifting without direction or urgency, as if even the dust had nowhere it needed to be. What the carpenter was beginning to understand, and what the woman with the chair already knew, is that forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not pretending the crack was never there. It is not sanding the surface smooth and painting over the break until you cannot see it. Forgiveness is choosing to repair rather than replace. It is looking at the damage and saying, "This happened. It matters, and I am going to keep going anyway." Jack Cornfield put it another way. He said that we do not have to improve ourselves. We just have to let go of what blocks our heart. The block is not the mistake. The block is the unforgiveness. The mistake happened once, on one day, in one moment. The refusal to forgive happens every day, in every quiet hour, in every replay. The Buddha had a word for this kind of patience: karma. It means forgiveness, but it also means patience. And its root meaning is something like earth-like. Earth-like. The earth bears the weight of everything that has ever fallen on it. Rain and snow and footsteps and buildings and the slow, heavy press of time. And it does not break. It does not refuse. It does not hold a grudge against the rain for falling. It simply holds. And in the holding, things grow. Tonight, if there is something you have been carrying, a word you said, a choice you made, a moment you wish you could live again, you are not the only one who carries such things. We all do. We carry them in our chests, in our jaws, in the muscles of our shoulders that tighten without being asked. We carry them into sleep and out of sleep and back into sleep again. And we wonder sometimes whether the carrying will ever end. But here is something worth noticing. We are often the last person we forgive. We forgive our friends for their carelessness. We forgive strangers for their rudeness. We forgive people who have hurt us more deeply than we have ever hurt ourselves. But when we turn that same forgiveness inward, when we try to extend to ourselves the same grace we extend to everyone else. Something stops us. Something says, "You do not deserve it. You should have known better. You should have been better." And we believe that voice because it sounds like the truth, and because we have been listening to it for so long that we have forgotten it is optional. You are allowed to put it down. Not the memory may stay, but the weight of it, the punishment of it, the nightly ritual of reopening the wound to make sure it still hurts. You are allowed to let that go. Not because what happened does not matter, but because you matter too. At a roadside tea stall, in a country where the evenings arrive with the sudden weight of warm air and the sound of insects rising from the grass, a woman sat on a wooden bench and waited for her tea. She had been traveling for a long time. Not traveling toward anything in particular, more traveling away, though from what? She could no longer say with certainty. She had been a teacher once, a good one, she thought, though the word good had become complicated over the years. The way all simple words become complicated when you turn them over enough times. Steam rose from the blackened pot on the charcoal fire, and the tea cellar. A quiet man with hands that moved the way water moves, without wasted motion, poured the first cup. The oil lamp on the wooden counter threw amber light across everything, turning the steam golden, and the shadows long, and the dust on the road into something that looked almost beautiful. Crickets sang in the grass beyond the road, rising and falling in waves, like breathing, like something alive and ancient, and entirely unconcerned with human trouble. The air was warm and heavy, and sat on her skin like a second layer of clothing, and the wooden bench beneath her was worn smooth by years of travelers, and still faintly warm from the heat of the day. She could smell the rain before it arrived. That particular smell of ozone and dust. That means the sky is about to open, and beneath it, the smell of ginger and honey from the tea, which the cellar brewed in the old way, with fresh root and wild honey from hives he kept behind the stall. She told him her story, not the whole of it. Travelers never tell the whole of anything, but enough. She had left her teaching position years ago. There had been a mistake, not a catastrophic one. No one was hurt. No one was harmed, but it was a mistake that shamed her, a professional error that made her feel, in a single afternoon, that she was not worthy of the position she held, the students she taught, the life she had built around the idea that she was competent and careful and good. She had resigned before anyone asked her to. She had packed a bag. She had been walking ever since. The tea seller listened without interrupting. When she finished, he did something she did not expect. He picked up the first cup of tea he had poured, the one sitting on the counter, the one he had poured before she began her story, and he poured it out onto the ground. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "The first pour always carries dust," he said. "Dust from the leaves, from the drying, from the road the tea traveled to get here. It does not mean the tea is bad. It means the tea needed to clear itself before it could be what it truly is." He poured a second cup. The liquid was clean, amber, fragrant, the color of late afternoon light. He set it in front of her. "Drink," he said. "This is the real cup." She held it in both hands. The warmth moved through her palms and into her wrists and up her arms. Pema Chodron once wrote that having compassion starts and ends with having compassion for all those unwanted parts of ourselves, all those imperfections that we do not even want to look at. She had not wanted to look at the mistake. She had not wanted to look at the version of herself that made it. She had poured herself out the way the tea seller poured out the first cup, discarding everything because of the dust, without stopping to consider that the dust was not the tea. The rain began, softly at first, On the leaves of the mango tree above the stall, a delicate tapping sound like fingers on a drum. Then on the tin roof, louder, steadier, a sound that enclosed the stall in its own small world. The road darkened. The dust turned to mud. The crickets went quiet, as if they too were listening. She did not know if she was forgiven. She was not sure forgiveness was even the right word. The mistake had happened. It could not unhappen. But the tea was warm, and the rain was steady, and the evening smelled of dust turning to earth, and she was here, alive, still walking, still able to taste sweetness, still able to sit on a bench in a country far from home and feel, in the warmth of a stranger's tea, something she had not felt in a very long time. That the first pour was not the only pour. That there was more in her than the dust. The rain fell harder. The lamp flickered, and she sat beneath the tin roof, with the tea in her hands, and the sound of the rain all around her. And she did not need to be anywhere else. And she did not need to be anyone else. And the evening held her the way the earth holds the rain, without complaint, without judgment, simply because that is what the earth does. Two monks were walking together along a muddy road after a heavy rain. They came to a river crossing, where a young woman stood at the bank, unable to cross. The water was high and fast, and her robes were thin, and she looked at the river the way a person looks at a problem that has no obvious solution. The first monk, without a word, picked her up and carried her across. He set her down on the other side. She thanked him. They bowed to each other. The monks continued walking. For hours, the second monk said nothing. But his silence was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a man composing a speech. Finally, as the sun was going down, he could no longer hold it in. "How could you do that?" he said. "We are monks. We are not supposed to touch women. You picked her up. You held her. You carried her in your arms." The first monk looked at him. His face was calm. His step had not changed. "I put her down at the river," he said. "Why are you still carrying her? What are you still carrying? What did you put down long ago? At a river, at a doorstep, at the end of a conversation, that your mind picked up again and has been carrying ever since. Not the event itself. The event is over. But the story about the event, the judgment, the sentence you passed on yourself and never commuted. Perhaps, right now, your hands can soften. You may not have noticed, but they may be holding something, curled slightly, gripping the edge of a blanket, or pressing into a pillow, or simply closed, the way hands close when the mind is gripping. Feel them now. Feel how they hold nothing. The fingers uncurl on their own, when the mind stops asking them to grip. The palms open. The wrists relax. This is not something you need to create. Your hands know how to let go. They have always known. It is the mind that forgets, the mind that picks things up long after the body has set them down. Let the hands rest. Let the fingers be open. Let the body show the mind what release feels like, quietly, without argument, without the need to understand it first. The body already knows. It has been waiting for you to stop carrying, and perhaps that is enough for now. Let the breath come gently. Let the quiet deepen around you. Let the rain, wherever it is falling tonight, fall without your help. When you are ready, we will continue together. And perhaps the greatest act of self-compassion is not forgiving yourself for what you have done wrong, but accepting that your ordinary, unremarkable, everyday life has been enough all along. That the meals you cooked, and the floors you swept, and the quiet mornings when nothing happened, were not failures of a spiritual life. They were the spiritual life itself. And perhaps the greatest act of self-compassion is not forgiving yourself for what you have done wrong, but accepting that your ordinary, unremarkable, everyday life has been enough all along. that the meals you cooked, and the floors you swept, and the quiet mornings, when nothing happened, were not failures of a spiritual life. They were the spiritual life itself. Take a breath, let it settle somewhere deep, and let us go now to a road at dawn, where a man is driving the same route he has driven 1,000 times before, believing it does not matter. The truck was old enough to have a personality. The engine had a particular rumble, not smooth, not broken, but somewhere in between, the way a voice sounds when it has been talking all day and has settled into its honest register. The dashboard glowed amber in the dark. The fuel gauge, the speedometer, the temperature needle that always sat a little higher than it should, and the light from the gauges reflected faintly in the windshield, giving him a ghost of himself hovering over the road ahead. A thermos of coffee was wedged between the seat and the center console, its cap slightly loose, so that every time the road bumped, and this road bumped often, a thin thread of steam escaped, and the cab filled with the smell of coffee that had been brewed too strong and too early, and was exactly what he needed. The dawn was coming in stages. First the grey, the colorless, uncertain grey, that could be dawn or could be something else, the way the first note of a song could be any song. Then a flush of pink along the eastern hills, thin as a brushstroke, barely there. Then gold, slow, steady gold that climbed the windshield like water climbing a wall, filling the cab with light that was warm to look at, even though the air outside was cold. The gravel road crunched under the tires, with a sound that was half crackle and half sigh. Dew sat on the fields, on either side, thousands of tiny droplets catching the new light, turning the grass into something that looked like scattered glass, or like a field of small fires burning cold. He cracked the window. The air that came in smelled of diesel and wet grass, and the particular freshness of a morning that has not yet been used by anyone. He breathed it in. He had been driving this route for 11 years. The same roads, the same farms, the same fences with their same leaning posts. He knew where every pothole was. He knew which dogs would chase the truck and which ones would watch it pass, with the ancient disinterest of animals who have seen everything. He knew the names of the people he delivered to, and the names of their children, and which ones would invite him in for tea, and which ones would simply nod and take the boxes and close the door. It was not, by any standard he could think of, a meaningful life. Not the kind of life you read about. Not the kind of life anyone would write a book about or make a speech about, or hold up as an example of a life well lived. He delivered things: groceries, medicine, animal feed, machine parts. He loaded boxes at one end of the road and unloaded them at the other. And in between he drove, and the road was the road, and the fields were the fields. And the dawn came every morning whether he noticed it or not. He was thinking about this, about the ordinariness of it, about the flatness of a life lived in repetition, when he saw the figure walking along the shoulder, a man walking slowly, with a shaved head and simple clothes, and a small cloth bag slung over one shoulder. He was not hitchhiking. He was not holding out a hand or standing at a visible spot. He was simply walking, the way some people walk, as if the destination were less important than the walking itself. The driver slowed and pulled alongside him. "Where are you headed?" The man looked up. His face was calm, not the forced calm of someone trying to appear serene, but the natural calm of someone who has genuinely stopped hurrying. "The next village," he said, "but there is no rush. Get in. I am going that way." The man climbed into the cab. He smelled of wood smoke and rain, and something the driver could not identify. Something clean and simple, like stone. He set his bag on the floor, between his feet, and looked through the windshield at the road. with an expression of mild interest, as if the road was something he had not seen before, even though it was the same road everyone had seen. They drove in silence for a while. The engine rumbled. The coffee steamed. The gravel crunched. "What do you do?" the man asked. "Nothing important," the driver said. "I deliver things." "What things?" He shrugged. "Groceries, medicine, feed for animals, parts for machines, whatever people need." "And the people, do they need these things?" "Of course they do. That is why they order them. And you bring them every day before they run out." "Usually, yes, is the point." The man nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the fields, at the dew, at the fences, and the dogs, and the smoke rising from farmhouse chimneys. "You arrive before they ask," he said. "You carry what they need, across distances they cannot cross themselves. You do this every day, without ceremony, without recognition, without anyone standing at the door to thank you for the fact that the medicine arrived right in time or the feed was there before the animals went hungry." The driver said nothing. He had never heard his work described this way. It sounded, in the stranger's mouth, like something else entirely. Shunryu Suzuki, who was a Zen teacher in America, once said something I have always remembered. The man continued. He said that strictly speaking, there is no such thing as an enlightened person. There is only enlightened activity, not a state you achieve and hold forever, but something you do, moment by moment, in the ordinary course of a day, loading a box, driving a road, bringing what is needed to where it is needed. He paused. "What would you call that, if not service?" The driver pulled over at the edge of the village. The man picked up his bag, nodded once. Not a bow, not a gesture loaded with meaning, just a nod, the kind you give to someone you have shared a cab with and may never see again, and climbed out. He walked into the village without looking back, his shadow stretching long behind him on the gravel road, and the driver sat in the truck with the engine idling, the coffee growing cold, and the dawn fully arrived. He looked at the road ahead, the same road, the same fields, the same fences leaning the same way they had leaned for years. Nothing had changed. The route was the route. The boxes were the boxes. The life was the life. But something had shifted, not in the road, not in the work, but in the way he saw them. The way you can live in a house for 20 years, and one morning notice a window you have never looked through, and the view from that window changes everything. Not because the view is new, but because you finally turned your head. His hands rested on the steering wheel. The thermos leaked a thin line of coffee down the side of the console. The sun was fully up now, warm through the glass, and the road stretched ahead. Ordinary, unchanged, and somehow, for the first time in 11 years, enough. How many of us lie awake at night, believing our lives should look different, that the work we do is too small, too plain, too ordinary to matter, that somewhere, someone else is living the meaningful life, the life with purpose, with direction, with the clean lines of a story that makes sense. We wait for the extraordinary moment, the retreat on the mountaintop, the breakthrough in the quiet room, the sign from the universe that we are on the right path. And while we wait, life happens. The dishes get washed, the children get fed, the floor gets swept. And we dismiss these things as filler, as the boring parts between the meaningful parts, not realizing that they were the meaningful parts all along. Jack Cornfield once wrote that wherever you are is the perfect place to awaken, and that this moment is the exact place to practice compassion and loving awareness. Not tomorrow, not on retreat, not after you have fixed everything that is wrong with your life. This moment, this breath, this ordinary, unremarkable, perfectly adequate Tuesday night A monk once arrived at a monastery a long journey. He was tired and hungry, and full of questions. He had traveled a great distance to find wisdom. The kind of wisdom that would transform his life. The kind that would make the journey worthwhile. The kind that would justify the blisters on his feet and the months he had spent walking. He was brought before the master, Zhaozhou, one of the most celebrated Zen teachers in history. Zhaozhou looked at him. "Have you eaten your rice?" he asked. The monk blinked. "Yes," he said, "I have." "Then wash your bowl." The monk stood there, waiting for the rest, the teaching, the explanation, the moment of profundity that would crack the world open and show him what was hidden inside. But there was no rest. That was the teaching. Wash your bowl. Eat when you are hungry. Sleep when you are tired. Walk when you are walking. Not somewhere else. Not in pursuit of some higher state. Here, in the washing, in the eating, in the sleeping, in the walking. The whole of the way, the entire path, from beginning to end, in 2 sentences and a dirty bowl, in a monastery on a mountainside, in a kitchen that had fed monks for longer than anyone alive could remember. A woman stood at a stone sink and washed the last of the evening dishes. The water was hot, so hot that her hands had turned red up to the wrists, and the steam rose in slow columns that caught the light from the single window above the sink. The stone floor was cold beneath her bare feet, the kind of cold that reminds you that you have a body, that your body is standing on something, that the something is real and solid and holding you up without being asked. The chopping block sat on the counter beside her, a thick slab of hardwood that had been in this kitchen since before she arrived. Since before anyone currently living in the monastery had arrived. The surface was worn concave from decades of blades, a valley in the wood, smooth as skin, shaped by the accumulated pressure of 10,000 meals. She ran her hand across it sometimes, feeling the curve, the way you run your hand across the face of someone you love. Not to check for flaws, but simply to know it is there. The kitchen smelled of ginger and rice, and the particular sweetness of onions that had been cooked slowly, over low heat, with patience. Moonlight came through the window above the sink, a square of silver that fell on the stone floor and moved, inch by inch, as the night progressed. From somewhere above, the meditation hall, 2 floors up, she could hear the monks chanting their evening prayers. The sound came through the floor as a vibration more than a melody, a low hum that she felt in the soles of her feet and in the base of her throat. The tap dripped. It had dripped for 15 years. She had stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. It was simply the sound of the kitchen being alive. She had come to this monastery as a young woman, full of fire, full of ideas about what spiritual life should look like. The cushion, the silence, the hours of meditation that would peel away the layers of self until only the truth remained. She had arrived with a small bag and a large ambition. The abbot had looked at her, considered her for a long moment, and said, "Go to the kitchen." She had waited for the day he would call her out, the day he would say, "You are ready now, come and sit with us." She waited through the first year, and the second, and the 5th. She waited through her 20s, and her 30s, and the first grey years of her 40s. She peeled 10,000 carrots. She stirred 10,000 pots of rice. She learned the sound each vegetable makes when the knife moves through it at the right speed. The crisp snap of a radish, the soft resistance of a mushroom, the fibrous crunch of celery, the silence of a tomato splitting along its seam. She learned how rice sounds when it is almost done, a faint crackling, like someone whispering. She learned how water sounds when it is about to boil, a low murmur that rises from the bottom of the pot, like a question forming in the mind. And somewhere in all of that, she could not tell you when, because it did not happen in a moment but over years. The way a river carves a valley, she stopped waiting, not because she gave up, not because she surrendered her ambition or decided she was not worthy of the meditation hall, but because she realized the way dawn realizes itself, without announcement, without effort, that attention is attention, that the quality of presence she had been seeking on the cushion was the same quality of presence she was already practicing with the knife, that a carrot peeled with full awareness is a prayer, that a pot of rice stirred without distraction is a sitting meditation, that the kitchen, this kitchen, with its dripping tap and its worn chopping block and its stone floor and its smell of ginger, was her meditation hall. It had been her meditation hall all along. She had not been excluded from the practice. She had been given the practice in its purest form, wrapped in onion skins and rice steam, disguised as something ordinary. Zen Master Dogen once wrote that when we discover that the truth is already in us, we are all at once our original selves. She had spent 30 years looking for the truth in the hall upstairs. The truth had been in her hands the whole time, in the peeling, in the stirring, in the washing, in the slow, patient work of feeding people who were too busy seeking enlightenment to notice that someone was making their dinner. She dried the last dish, set it on the shelf. The kitchen was clean. The moonlight had moved across the floor and now fell on the chopping block, filling the worn valley with silver light, illuminating the curve that 30 years of blades and hands and meals had carved into the wood. She placed her hand on the block. It was smooth and cool, and it held the shape of every meal she had ever made, not in memory, but in the wood itself, in the grain, in the slow wearing away of surface that is not erosion, but devotion. Upstairs, the chanting ended. Silence moved through the monastery like water, through stone, slow, thorough, filling every space. She stood in her kitchen, in the moonlight, in the quiet, needing nothing, having missed nothing, having already arrived at the place she spent 30 years believing she had not been invited to. The tap dripped, the floor was cold, the chopping block held its valley of silver light, and she was here, she was home, she had always been home. Perhaps tonight, lying here, you can feel the ordinariness of this moment, and for once, not wish it were something else, not wish it were deeper, or more meaningful, or more spiritual. Just this, just a body lying down, just breath moving in and out, just the quiet sound of whatever is around you. A clock, a fan, the settling of a house, the distant hum of a world that is still turning without asking for your help. The Buddha had a word for this quality of attention, sati. In the West, it is often translated as mindfulness, and it has become something complicated, something requiring apps and courses and timers and special cushions. But sati simply means remembering to be present. That is all. Remembering that you are here, not somewhere else, not in tomorrow, not in the mistake you made last week. Here, and it is available in every breath, every blink, every heartbeat. You do not need a cushion. You do not need a monastery. You do not need anyone's permission. You are already practicing it right now, lying here, listening, breathing, letting the stories wash over you without grasping at them. This is sati. Your body is already doing what the monks on the cushion are trying to do, being still, being present, being here. You are not failing at spiritual life. You are not missing the important part. You are in the important part. You have been in it all evening. You have been in it your whole life, and perhaps that is enough. Let the breath come slowly. Let the ordinariness hold you the way the kitchen held the cook, without judgment, without expectation, simply because holding is what it does. When you are ready, we will continue together. And so, we come to the last teaching of this evening, the one that has been waiting beneath all the others, quiet and patient, like a river beneath a river. It is the simplest thing the Buddha ever pointed to, and it is this: you are allowed to rest, not because you have earned it, not because you have finished everything on your list, but because rest is not a reward. It is a birthright, and it has been yours all along. And so we come to the last teaching of this evening, the one that has been waiting beneath all the others, quiet and patient, like a river beneath a river. It is the simplest thing the Buddha ever pointed to, and it is this: you are allowed to rest, not because you have earned it, not because you have finished everything on your list, but because rest is not a reward. It is a birthright, and it has been yours all along. Let your breath come without effort. Let the quiet hold you, and let us sit with this, the simplest and perhaps the hardest truth of all. We treat rest as something to be earned, the way you earn a paycheck, the way you earn a day off, the way you earn the right to sit down only after everything else is done. We treat stillness as a luxury and busyness as proof that we matter. We run through our days trying to become a better version of ourselves, a thinner version, a calmer version, a more productive version, a more spiritual version. And we collapse at night not into rest, but into the exhaustion of the trying. And even then, lying in the dark, the mind keeps running its list. What I should have done, what I should have been, who I should have become by now. What if the trying is the exhaustion? What if the version of you lying here right now, tired, imperfect, unfinished, still carrying the day in your shoulders and your jaw, is not a rough draft? What if this is not a version that needs revision? What if this is simply you, whole, present, alive, and there is nothing left to fix? There is a tree you may have seen, or one very like it, a tree in winter. You know the kind. The branches are bare. There are no leaves, no blossoms, no fruit. The bark is dark and rough, and the branches reach upward into a grey sky like hands that have stopped reaching for anything in particular, and are simply open. If you walked past this tree in July, you would barely notice it. It would be full and green, and doing what trees do in summer. But in winter, stripped of everything that makes it recognizable, it stands in a kind of radical nakedness that can look, if you are not paying attention, like failure. But the tree is not failing. It is not broken. It has not forgotten how to grow. It is resting. And the rest is not a pause between seasons of productivity. It is a season. As necessary as spring, as meaningful as summer, as purposeful as autumn. The sap has pulled inward, away from the branches, down into the trunk, down into the roots, where no one can see it. The roots are deepening, pushing further into the dark soil, drawing from reserves that were built during the seasons of visible growth. The tree is doing exactly what it should be doing. Nothing visible, everything essential. It is gathering itself. It is preparing for something it cannot yet see. And it does this without anxiety, without apology, without wondering whether the other trees are resting better. The rest is not the absence of life. The rest is life, turned inward, doing its quietest and most important work. In a room at the end of a hallway, in a house that was still learning the sounds a family makes, a woman sat in a rocking chair and held her sleeping child. It was 2 a.m. The nightlight on the dresser cast a warm amber glow that turned the walls soft gold and made the shadows gentle. Not the sharp, angular shadows of daytime, but the round, blurred shadows of a room that has been designed, without anyone planning it, for exactly this purpose. Holding people while they sleep. The baby's breathing was the loudest sound in the room. Small, fast, slightly raspy, with a rhythm that was not quite regular, as if even in sleep, the lungs were still figuring out how to do this new thing called breathing. His weight against her chest was heavier than you would expect from something so small. A warm, solid heaviness that pressed her into the chair and made her aware of her own body in a way she rarely was during the day, when she was moving too fast to notice anything. She could feel his heartbeat through the thin fabric of her nightgown, faster than hers, lighter, like a small drum played by someone who has not yet learned to be tired. The rocking chair creaked with each push of her foot, a sound that had become, over the past 3 months, as familiar as her own pulse. The window beside her was cool against her temple when she leaned against it, and through the glass she could see the outline of the oak tree in the yard, leafless, still, holding the sky the way she was holding the baby, without complaint, without effort, simply because that is what it did. An owl called from somewhere in the branches. 2 low notes, repeated, patient, as if the owl had all the time in the world, which it did. The room smelled of baby, milk and soap, and something she could not name. Something that was simply the smell of new life, of skin that has not yet been weathered, of breath that has not yet carried a single lie. She was running the list. She always ran the list at this hour. It was the only hour quiet enough to hear it clearly. She should be more patient. She should be more present. She should be more grateful for this time, because everyone told her it goes so fast and she would miss it. And the fact that she was too exhausted to enjoy it made her feel guilty for being exhausted, which made her more exhausted, which made her more guilty. She had read a book about mindful parenting, and it had made her feel worse. She had tried to meditate while the baby napped, and she had fallen asleep on the floor and woken up with carpet marks on her cheek, and a baby crying in the next room, and a feeling in her chest that was not peace, but its opposite. She saw the other mothers online, organized, glowing, grateful, holding their babies in fields of wildflowers, with the golden light behind them, and their hair doing something hers had never done. She saw the women who had figured it out, the ones who made it look easy, who posted about their morning routines and their meditation practices and their clean kitchens. And she compared their wildflower fields to her nursery at 2 a.m. with its spit-up stain on her shoulder and the dark circles under her eyes and the owl outside that would not stop asking the same question. And then something happened that was not dramatic and not sudden and not anything she could have predicted. The baby's breathing slowed, not stopped, just slowed, deepened, settled into the rhythm that meant he had crossed from light sleep into the kind of sleep that does not startle at sounds. His weight shifted. Not much, just a fraction, settling further into her chest, as if his body had finally decided to trust hers completely. The room was quiet. The rocking chair creaked once more, and then was still, and she realized, not as a thought, but as something that arrived in her body, the way warmth arrives when you step into sunlight, that this was it. This was the meditation. Not the app on her phone, not the book on mindful parenting, not the cushion she had never managed to sit on. This, a woman holding a child in the dark, breathing, rocking, being present. Not because she had chosen to be present, but because there was nowhere else to be. This was the practice, and it had been the practice all along, and she had been doing it perfectly, every night, at this hour, in this chair, without knowing it. Pema Chodron once wrote that the happiness we seek is already here, and that it will be found through letting go rather than through struggle. She had been struggling to be better, struggling to be calmer, struggling to match an image of motherhood that had never existed outside of a photograph. And the letting go was not a decision. It was a surrender that happened without her permission. In the rocking chair, at 2 in the morning, with an owl asking questions and a baby answering them with his breath. She could put him down now. He was deep enough in sleep. She could lay him in the crib and go back to bed and try to catch 2 hours before dawn. But she did not. She sat in the chair, holding him, feeling the weight of him, listening to the owl, feeling her own breath begin to match his. Slow, steady, unhurried, as if her lungs had finally remembered what they were for. The nightlight flickered once, a brief dimming, like an eye blinking, and then steadied. She was not a perfect mother. She was not an enlightened mother. She was a mother holding her child in the dark, and that was everything. And she did not need it to be anything more than exactly what it was. The owl called once more and then went quiet, as if it too had found what it was looking for. How much of your life have you spent trying to become a better version of yourself? Not a little, not occasionally, but constantly. A low, steady hum of self-improvement running beneath every day, every conversation, every quiet moment. Read this book, take this course, fix this flaw, develop this habit, break that one. Become someone who meditates, who exercises, who eats well, who sleeps well, who does not lie awake at night adding to the list of things that need to be fixed. And what if the trying itself is the exhaustion? Thich Nhat Hanh once said that the seed of suffering in you may be strong, but you should not wait until you have no more suffering before allowing yourself to be happy. We postpone rest the way we postpone happiness. Until we are ready, until we are worthy, until we have fixed enough of ourselves to deserve it. But completeness is not a destination you arrive at after enough self-improvement. It is a description of what you already are. You are not a project. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a person, lying in the dark, breathing, and that has always been enough. At the edge of a quarry, in the last light of a day, that would be the last working day of his life, a man stood with a chisel in his hand and looked at the stone face in front of him. The stone was warm. It had held the afternoon sun for hours, and the heat radiated from its surface, like the heat from a sleeping animal, slow and steady and alive, in a way that stone should not be alive but somehow always was. Stone dust hung in the golden light around him, like a second atmosphere, a fine, glittering haze that turned the air visible and made the quarry look, in this hour, like a room made of light. The chisel was heavy in his hand, heavy in the way that only familiar things are heavy, with a weight that is not just mass but memory. He had held this chisel for 40 years. He had shaped headstones with it, the names of people he had never met, carved into granite that would outlast everyone who mourned them. He had shaped lintels for doorways that people walked through every day without looking up. He had shaped steps that children climbed, and walls that held roofs and foundations that held walls. Other people's monuments, other people's thresholds, other people's homes. The echo of the quarry returned every sound to him, slightly changed. The tap of the chisel came back softer, delayed, as if the rock were thinking about it before answering. Sweat dried on his forearms in the evening breeze, and the breeze carried the smell of mineral and iron, and the particular dryness of freshly cut stone. A smell like the inside of the earth, like something that had been buried for 1,000,000 years, and was only now being exposed to air. A bell rang from the town below. End of day. The sound traveled up the quarry walls and arrived at his ears thin and clear, like a thread of silver drawn through the golden dust. He set down the chisel. The last time, he looked at his hands. They were not handsome hands. They were scarred across every knuckle, white lines and pink lines, and one deep groove along the base of his left thumb, where the chisel had slipped 20 years ago, and he had bled onto the stone he was carving, and the blood had dried into the grain, and was probably still there, somewhere, in someone's doorstep. The knuckles were thick. The fingers were permanently curved, shaped by decades of gripping. The creases in his palms were grey with stone dust, a greyness that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed, as if the stone had claimed a part of him, had worked its way into his skin, the way he had worked his way into its surface. He had never carved his name into anything. He had never built his own monument. His life had been one of shaping other people's stone into other people's visions. And at the end of it, he had nothing to show for himself except these hands. But standing there, in the last light, with the dust hanging golden in the air and the bell still ringing faintly from the town below, he looked at his hands and saw something he had not seen before. Not damage, not wear, evidence. These hands were carved by the same work that carved the stone. Every scar was a record. Every callus was a chapter. The grey in the creases was not dirt. It was the stone's way of saying, you were here. You touched me. You shaped me, and I shaped you. And neither of us is the same. Zen Master Dogen once wrote that to be in harmony with the wholeness of things is not to have anxiety over imperfections. These hands were imperfect. This life was imperfect. The quarry was closing. The chisel was down, and the hands, scarred, thick, permanently grey, were beautiful. Not despite the scars, but because of them, because they were evidence of a life lived in contact with something real, something that resisted, something that pushed back, something that demanded everything he had and took it and gave back this, a pair of hands that knew the weight of the world and were not sorry. He stood at the edge of the quarry. The sun was going down, the stone face in front of him changing color, the way a face changes expression. Amber, then rose, then a deep, bruised violet that made the rock look tender. The bell from the town rang a second time, softer now, as if it too were winding down. He put his hands in his pockets, hands that had nothing left to carry, nothing left to shape, nothing left to prove, and he felt for the first time the lightness of them. Not empty, light, the way hands feel when they have done what they were meant to do, and have finally, after 40 years of holding on, been allowed to let go. The quarry held its silence. The dust settled, and the evening came down around him, like a blanket lowered gently over a sleeping child. Slow, warm, asking nothing, covering everything. You too are allowed to rest. Not later. Not when you are finished. Not when you have earned it or deserve it or checked the last item off the list. Now. Here. In this breath. In this body. In this night that has been given to you without conditions. Jack Cornfield once wrote words so simple they can be heard even through the thickest exhaustion. Let go of the battle. Breathe quietly and let it be. Let your body relax and your heart soften. You've been battling something tonight. Perhaps you have been battling something for a long time. The battle to be better. The battle to be enough. The battle to earn the right to lie here without guilt. But the battle is over. It has been over for longer than you think. The only one still fighting is you. Feel the surface beneath you, the bed, the pillow, whatever is holding your weight right now. You do not need to hold yourself up tonight. Gravity is doing that work for you, and it has never once complained. It has been holding you since the day you were born, pressing you gently into the earth, keeping you grounded, keeping you here. You do not need to earn gravity. You do not need to deserve it. It simply holds. The Buddha had a word for this quality of acceptance. Upekkha. It is usually translated as equanimity, which sounds clinical, like something in a textbook. But upekkha is not clinical. It is warm. It means balanced acceptance, the ability to be present with what is, without needing it to be different. Not indifference, not resignation, not giving up, just the quiet, steady willingness to let this moment be this moment, without insisting it should be another one. You are practicing upekkha right now, lying here, accepting this night, not demanding that it be more peaceful, or more meaningful, or more anything, simply being here with what is here. That is enough. That has always been enough. Let the breath come without effort. Let the body sink a little deeper. Let the mind, if it wants to wander, wander. And when it comes back, welcome it the way you would welcome a friend who stepped outside for a moment and has now returned. No questions, no judgment, just, you are here. Good. And so our stories draw to a close. But before we part tonight, there is one more story I would like to tell you. The quietest one, the slowest one, the one that has been waiting at the end of this path, like a light left on in a window. It is about a woman who searched for a very long time for something she already had. And it begins, as all the best stories do, on an ordinary evening, in an ordinary place, with nothing remarkable happening at all. We have come to the end of our journey tonight. And what a journey it has been, though perhaps journey is not the right word, because you have not gone anywhere. You have been lying here, in the dark, in the quiet, and the stories have come to you, the way rain comes to a window, arriving without effort, asking nothing, simply falling. Tonight, we sat with a potter who held a bowl she almost destroyed and discovered it was whole. We sat with a doctor in a garden, watching a bent tree bear fruit it was never supposed to bear. We listened to a janitor in an empty classroom ask the only question that mattered. Whose voice is that in your head? We watched a fisherman on a lake learn that emotions are weather, and a nurse on a damp bench learn that she was the room the sadness passed through, not the sadness itself. We heard a blind woman tell a young musician that his playing was the most honest sound she had ever heard. We watched a calligrapher's brush slip and make the truest line of her life. We sat with a carpenter mending a cracked chair and a traveler drinking tea poured fresh after the dust was cleared. We followed a delivery driver who learned that his ordinary route was a form of service, and a temple cook who discovered that her kitchen was a meditation hall. We held a baby with a young mother at 2 a.m. and felt the weight of something that needed no improvement. And we stood with a stonecutter at the edge of a quarry, watching his scarred hands discover their own beauty in the last light of his final working day. These are not extraordinary people. They are people like you, people who carried a list of everything they thought was wrong with them. And one evening or one morning or one quiet moment, set it down, not because the list disappeared, but because they stopped believing it was the final word. And beneath all of their stories, 2 truths kept surfacing. The way stones surface in a riverbed when the water is clear enough to see the bottom. The first is this: you have always been whole, not whole in the way a finished product is whole, polished, complete, sealed in plastic. Whole in the way a living thing is whole, growing, changing, sometimes broken, sometimes mended, always alive. The wholeness was never something you needed to achieve. It was never waiting for you at the end of a journey, or at the bottom of a book, or on the other side of enough self-improvement. It has been here, in you, as you, beneath every doubt and every judgment, and every night you lay awake wondering what was wrong. The way a lamp is still burning, even when someone has covered it with a cloth. The light does not go out. It does not diminish, it waits. And when the cloth is lifted, not torn away, not ripped off in a dramatic moment of revelation, but simply lifted, gently, the way you might lift a blanket from a sleeping child, The light is exactly as it was, unchanged, undamaged. Yours. The sky was never harmed by the storms that passed through it. The gold was never tarnished by the cloth that covered it. And you who are lying here now, breathing, listening, still carrying whatever you carried into this night, you have never been less than what you are. The voice that said otherwise was not the truth. It was just a voice. And voices, like storms, like weather, like feelings, pass. The second truth is quieter and perhaps harder. You are allowed to put things down. The mistakes you have been carrying, the words you wish you could unsay. The version of yourself you keep comparing to, the one who would have done it differently, who would have known better, who would not be lying here tonight, still wondering. Those things are not chains welded to your body. They are stones in your hands, and hands can open, not once, in a single dramatic moment of forgiveness, but over and over, every night, every breath, every time you notice that you are gripping, and you choose, gently, without forcing, to let the fingers uncurl. You do not need to forgive yourself perfectly. You do not need to forgive yourself completely. You just need to forgive yourself tonight. And tomorrow night, if the stones return, you can set them down again. And the night after that, and the night after that. The setting down is not a failure of the forgiving. It is the practice of it. And now one more story. The last one, the quietest one, the one that has been waiting. In a small town by the sea, on a street where the cobblestones were uneven, and the rain collected in the dips and made small mirrors that reflected the street lamps back up at the sky, there was a bookshop. It was not a large bookshop. It was the kind of place you could walk past without noticing if you were not paying attention. A narrow storefront with a wooden door and a window full of books arranged with the kind of care that suggests someone is paying attention even when no one is watching. A bell hung above the door, a small brass bell that rang the same note for arrivals and departures, as if it saw no difference between the two. The woman who ran the shop had been there for almost 20 years. She opened the door every morning at 9 and closed it every evening at 6. And in between she did the things that people who run bookshops do. She shelved and sorted and recommended and wrapped and made tea for customers who stayed too long and never once asked them to leave. The shop smelled of paper and dust, and the particular warmth of a room that has been heated by the same radiator for 2 decades. The books sat in their rows on the shelves, some faded, some bright, all patient, all waiting for the hand that would reach for them. It was a winter evening. The rain had started an hour ago. Not heavy, not dramatic, just the steady, persistent rain of a coastal town in January. The kind of rain that does not announce itself, but simply arrives and stays. It fell on the front window and distorted the street lamp outside into a long smear of gold, as if the light were melting. The bell above the door was still. The shop was empty. She stood behind the counter with a cup of tea that had gone cold beside the register, its surface catching a faint reflection of the ceiling light, a small, still circle of warmth in a room full of paper and quiet. Her hands rested on the wooden counter. They were not young hands. The knuckles were beginning to thicken, and there were small lines at the base of each finger that had not been there 5 years ago. But they were not old hands either. They were hands that had turned 10,000 pages, hands that had wrapped 10,000 books in brown paper and tied them with string, hands that had pointed countless strangers toward the shelf, where the book they needed, the book they did not yet know they needed, was waiting. She had spent years believing something was fundamentally wrong with her. The belief was so old she could not remember when it had arrived. It was simply there, like the bell above the door, like the rain on the window, like the sound of the sea at night that she had stopped hearing because it was always there. She was not smart enough. She read constantly, voraciously, desperately, but no matter how many books she finished, she never felt she had read enough. She was not lovable enough. She lived alone, in a flat above the shop, and the aloneness felt not like a choice but like evidence, like proof that the thing that was wrong with her was visible to everyone but her. She was not enough. Not enough of what? She could never quite say. Only that the gap between who she was and who she should be had been the defining geography of her life, the landscape she woke up in every morning and fell asleep in every night. Tonight, closing up, counting the register, wiping the counter with the cloth she kept folded by the tea, she heard the bell ring. A customer, a man she did not recognize, wet from the rain, looking slightly lost, the way people in bookshops often look, as if they have wandered in from a larger storm and are surprised to find shelter. He browsed for 10 minutes. He chose a book. She did not see which one. He brought it to the counter. "Terrible night," he said, setting the book down. "It is," she agreed, wrapping it in brown paper. He looked around the shop, at the shelves, at the lamp, at the rain on the window, at the cup of cold tea on the counter. "I love this shop," he said. "It always feels like someone lives here." She handed him the wrapped book. He paid. He left. The bell rang, the same note for his leaving as for his arriving, and she stood behind the counter in the sudden quiet and heard his words again, turning them over the way she would turn a page. "It always feels like someone lives here." She looked around, the books in their rows, the lamp on the counter, warm and steady, the rain on the window, patient and unending, the cup of tea, cold now but still there, still hers, the bell, still vibrating faintly from the door's closing, a sound so small you would miss it if you were not listening. But she was listening, and she heard it. And it sounded like the last note of a song she had been trying to remember for 20 years. "Someone does live here," she thought. "I live here." She had made this place, not with grand ambition or brilliant strategy or the kind of purpose that gets written about in magazines. She had made it by showing up every morning for 20 years, opening the door, turning on the light, shelving the books, making the tea, being here, not perfectly, not remarkably, not in any way that anyone would write a story about, just here. And the aliveness of the shop, the warmth of it, the smell of it, the feeling the man had described, the feeling of someone living here, was not something she had manufactured. It had simply happened. It had grown around her the way moss grows on a stone, not because the stone is trying, but because the stone is there. She turned off the lamp. She put on her coat. She locked the register and washed the teacup and set it upside down on the cloth to dry. She checked the windows. She turned off the radiator. She walked to the door and stood there for a moment, looking back at the shop in the dark, at the shapes of the shelves, at the faint gleam of the window, at the 20 years of her life, arranged in rows and waiting for tomorrow. She stepped outside, locked the door. The rain was cold on her face, not unpleasant, just real, just water, just the sky doing what the sky does. She walked home along the cobblestones, stepping around the puddles that held the street lamps like small golden bowls. And for the first time in a very long time, perhaps for the first time in her life, she did not wish to be anywhere else. She did not wish to be someone else. She did not wish the evening were different, or the rain were lighter, or her life were larger. The rain fell, the street lamps blurred, her shoes were wet, and she was here. In this town, in this life, in this body that had carried her through everything. And nothing was missing. Nothing had ever been missing. The search itself had been the suffering, and the stopping, the simple, quiet stopping, was the peace. She reached her door, put the key in the lock. The lock turned with a sound that was so familiar it was almost silent. The door opened. The hallway was dark and warm, and smelled of the lavender she had hung from the ceiling last autumn, and the scent met her like a hand extended in welcome. She stepped inside. She was home. She had always been home. If this brought you some peace tonight, you are welcome to subscribe for more long-form audio like this, and share it with anyone who could use a slower night. Original commentary, stories, and script. Written and produced by Moonlit Dharma. Thank you for joining us here at Moonlit Dharma. And now, as the stories settle and the night grows deeper, perhaps you notice that your body has already begun its own quiet journey toward rest. The shoulders, perhaps they have dropped since we began, just a little. Just enough that you can feel the difference between where they were and where they are now. You did not decide to drop them. They dropped on their own, the way snow drops from a branch when it has held enough. Not a collapse, but a release. The jaw may have softened. That place where you hold the words you did not say, the arguments you did not finish, the tension of a day spent keeping your face arranged in the right expression. Perhaps it has loosened, just a fraction, just enough to feel the space between your teeth where there was no space before. The hands wherever they are resting, on the blanket, beside your body, curled against the pillow, may feel heavier than they did 3 hours ago. Not the heaviness of fatigue, but the heaviness of surrender, the kind of weight that comes when you finally stop holding something you have been holding for a very long time. The fingers may be slightly open, the palms may be soft. This is not something you are doing. This is something your body remembers when the mind stops giving it instructions. The breath has found its own rhythm now. Slower than it was at the beginning, deeper, steadier. The way a river slows when it reaches the plain after coming down the mountain. You do not need to breathe a certain way. The breath will breathe itself. It has been doing this since the moment you were born, and it has never once needed your supervision. And the whole body, the whole weight of you, the whole miraculous, imperfect, scarred and tender and breathing weight of you is settling deeper now, sinking into whatever is holding you. The way a stone sinks through warm water, not falling, settling, finding the place where it belongs, which is here, which has always been here, which was waiting for you long before you arrived. The eyes, if they are still open, may begin to close on their own, and if they are already closed, that is fine too. The darkness behind your eyelids is not emptiness. It is the same darkness that holds the stars. And so the night continues. The rain is still falling somewhere, on a bookshop window, on a quarry, on a garden where a bent tree stands in the dark, still bearing fruit. The river is still running clear after the storm. The kitchen is still warm, and the chopping block is still holding its valley of moonlight. And somewhere a potter is sleeping beside a shelf of bowls she decided to keep. The gold is still there. It was always there, beneath the cloth, beneath the dust, beneath the years of doubt and the long nights of wandering. It did not need to be polished. It did not need to be earned. It simply needed to be seen. And tonight, perhaps, in the space between one story and the next, in the breath between one thought and no thought at all, you caught a glimpse of it, a flicker, a warmth, a quiet knowing that has nothing to do with the mind and everything to do with the place beneath the mind where nothing has ever been wrong. You do not need to hold on to it. It will not leave. It has been with you through every night you have ever lived, and it will be with you through this one, and through the next, and through all the nights that follow, whether you are aware of it or not. The gold does not require your attention to exist. It simply exists, the way your heartbeat exists, the way the rain exists, the way the night exists, vast, unhurried, holding everything, asking nothing. The rain is still falling, the night is still here, and you are still here too, breathing, resting, whole. Let the stories dissolve now, the way ink dissolves in water. Slowly, softly, becoming part of something larger. Let the words fade. The way lamplight fades when you walk away from it, not into darkness, but into the kind of quiet that has always been waiting on the other side of language. And if sleep comes, let it come, let it arrive, the way the rain arrived, the way the stories arrived, the way the night arrived, without announcement, without effort, without asking your permission. You have done everything you needed to do tonight. You have listened, you have rested, you have been here, and that was always, always enough. The rain falls, the night holds, and you are home.